Keir Starmer's had a tough year and a bit as Prime Minister. His approval ratings have cratered, borrowing costs have surged, and the most recent poll we could find put Labour in joint third, on a par with the Tories, 16 points behind Reform and a point behind the Greens. Nonetheless, there's long been a sense that, for all his shortcomings, Starmer isn't going anywhere. After all, he's still got a stonking majority in the Commons, and is just the fourth Labour leader in British political history to actually win an election. Unfortunately for Starmer, that's apparently changed, and Labour MPs have been telling Westminster journos that the situation has become terminal. So, in this video, we thought we'd try to explain how they've come to this conclusion, and why Starmer's eventual ousting looks increasingly inevitable. Explore which world leaders are winning and which are losing every week with our podcast, the World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So before we get into it, a quick caveat. In this video, we're not saying that Starmer's downfall is imminent. Rather, we're saying that there are now a number of structural factors that are constantly dragging Starmer down, making it near impossible for him to recover. There are at least three structural factors. The first is what we might call his budget dilemma. The second is that he's now so unpopular that he can't recover. And the third is that he lacks a long-term project to convince Labour MPs and voters to stick with him. Let's start with a budget dilemma. In short, Starmer boxed himself in at the last general election by doing two things. First, promising not to raise any major taxes. And second, setting himself some relatively strict fiscal rules, limiting how much he can borrow. Importantly, these borrowing limits are based on forecasts by the Office for Budget Responsibility, or OBR, which happen every 6 months. This might have worked if the UK economy had suddenly boomed, but while the UK is faring better than some of its peers, the global economy as a whole has slowed, largely thanks to Trump's unorthodox trade policies, taking the UK with it. In practice, this has meant that, every 6 months, when the OBR releases a new forecast showing that things haven't got better, to adhere to its own fiscal rules, the government currently has to either tinker with some minor taxes to raise revenue or cut spending. This is clearly unsustainable. Businesses don't like the government constantly fiddling with taxes, and neither voters nor Labour MPs like spending cuts. This has left Starmer with a budget dilemma. He can either continue to stumble on and desperately hope that the UK economy suddenly booms, which feels unlikely, or, at the next budget, he can break one of the two promises he made during the campaign. In other words, either raise one of the major taxes, like income tax, or do away with his fiscal rules. Of these two options, raising taxes looks more feasible, largely because the bond markets don't really want to lend the UK much more money anyway, at least not without very high interest rates. At the moment, it seems that Starmer is planning to bite the bullet and raise taxes. But while this might be the lesser of two evils, it's still pretty terrible for Starmer. Breaking manifesto commitments isn't always the end of the world, but it's a bad look when A, it's a commitment that everyone knows about and that you reiterated hundreds of times, and B, you don't have a good excuse for breaking it. Starmer and Reeves are currently trying to blame Brexit, but this doesn't really fly, because everybody already knew about the negative economic consequences of Brexit back when Starmer made those promises. This will also make Starmer's removal even more tempting for Labour MPs, because Starmer can take the fall for the tax rises, and a new leader can reap the political rewards of that newfound fiscal space. The second structural issue facing Starmer is his unpopularity. As a politician, being a bit unpopular isn't the end of the world. You can just do popular things to turn the tide. Starmer's allies in Parliament, for instance, like to point to Margaret Thatcher's first term. Like Starmer, her first year was a bit of a disaster, and her approval rating slumped. But then she started doing popular things, her approval ratings improved, and she went on to win 2 more elections. The problem with this analogy, though, is that Thatcher was only quite unpopular. Even at her lowest moments in her first and second terms, her approval ratings never really dropped below 30%, and her net approval rating rarely fell below -35. Starmer is way less popular. Most pollsters currently put his approval rating below 20%, and his net approval rating somewhere between -40 and -50. And these numbers will probably fall further after the tax rises at the budget. A recent Ipsos poll put his approval rating at just 13%, with a net rating of -66, the lowest satisfaction rating recorded by the pollster for any Prime Minister going back to 1977. When you're this unpopular, even when you do popular things, instead of those things making you more popular, their newfound association with you makes the things themselves less popular. We're already seeing this with Starmer. Digital ID, for instance, was actually a pretty popular policy before Starmer endorsed it, at which point the public turned on it. A poll in June found that 53% of voters were in favour of digital ID cards for all Britons, with just 19% against. Polling after Starmer's endorsement, however, found that the percentage in favour had fallen to 31%, with 45% now against. So, you get the idea. There comes a point where you're so unpopular that there's no way out. Anyway, the third structural problem for Starmer is that he doesn't have a long-term vision or project to convince not just voters, but also Labour MPs that all this pain is worth it. This is something that lots of Westminster journos are talking about. Apparently, when they talk to Labour MPs, their main problem is that they don't understand what this is all for. If there was some grand project in mind, some light at the end of the tunnel, they might be more willing to accept Starmer doing unpopular things like raising taxes. But the lack of project or vision means that they just don't think it's worth it. Like the other two problems, this doesn't seem fixable. Starmer has proved singularly incapable of articulating any grand vision for Britain, and at this point he's tried so many resets and come up with so many missions, milestones and foundations that voters have just stopped listening. You get the idea. While Starmer's downfall probably isn't imminent, although Labour's appalling result at the Caerphilly by-election last month has apparently sparked some chatter about the prospect of a post-budget leadership challenge, things aren't going well, and perhaps more significantly, now look unlikely to get better, making it increasingly hard to see Starmer surviving next year's local elections. We discuss those elections in the next edition of our magazine Too Long, where we have whole articles about what each party needs to do in the local elections, looking at polling since the election and going through a checklist of what both Starmer and Farage need to achieve in the coming months. The next issue of our magazine Too Long is all about that, with our headline section titled The New Middle East. In it, we run through each country in the region and discuss their future, before reflecting on how recent events have reshaped the Middle East forever. We obviously talk about the Middle East a lot in videos, but this is our most zoomed out, detailed and thought through coverage yet, truly outlining how we see this region re-emerging. It's not just that though, there's also been a whole lot of major elections this year. So in this issue we have a whole section talking about all of the major elections that have taken place this year, and how global politics has changed. There's also articles on everything from China's continued dominance, politics in the UK, and how politicians have hijacked social media. This latest issue is now available to pre-order on our website, and as always, subscribing will get you 20% off not only this copy, but also every future copy as long as you're subscribed. Plus, just this time round, we're offering bundles with our book Assembly Required and our 2026 calendar. For instance, you can subscribe to Too Long and get a copy of the book for just £43.99, or add a calendar for only a few pounds more. Anyway, click the link in the description for all of the offers, and thank you for supporting the channel.